While Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon is not a very competitive card, I did want to mention at the very start of this video that it's pretty darn cool when it gets summoned in the anime. I'm not the type of person to get hyped up when certain cards are activated or certain cards are summoned while watching Yu-Gi-Oh! Either on the TV show or the movies, but Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon specifically has always been really cool, and to me personally, probably one of the coolest monsters that gets summoned in the early episodes. Unfortunately for fans of Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, this is not an anime review channel, so I'm not going to spend any time talking about how awesome or powerful or overpowered that card is in relation to the anime duels that it was featured in. I'm only going to be focusing on how good this card was in competitive play, and realistically this card isn't very strong. However, I wanted to talk about at the beginning of this video, like I do with all of these Why Nobody Plays, there are actually two specific cases where technically this card did see play as a one of in a couple extra decks. The first place that this card technically saw play was in decks using Cyberstein. Cyberstein was a prize card back from 2004 that you got by winning a Shonen Jump championship, and when you played that card you could pay 5,000 life points to summon Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon straight from your extra deck for free. Well, free after the 5,000 life points, that is. The realistic part of this story though is that most people, even if they did have a copy of Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon in their extra deck, weren't summoning it over other options. Back in the day there wasn't an extra deck limit, it wasn't even called the extra deck, it was called the fusion deck, and you could put as many cards in there as you wanted, and in most cases people still would use Cyberstein to summon things like Cyber Twin Dragon or Cyber End Dragon or Gatling Dragon, not really Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was an option for a big monster you could summon, 4,500 attack points, but in most cases you weren't actually bringing that out over other options, because other options, even though they didn't have the raw strength of Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, had more useful effects. Please keep in mind though that Cyberstein was very difficult to obtain, being a prize card, so most people didn't really have access to it to even try to summon Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and more so, Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was actually released over a year after the release of Cyberstein. I don't think this is a very secret fact, it's not a very unknown fact, but it's still pretty fun. I think most people realize that Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was released later than they originally thought, but what's funny about it is that Blue Eyes Shining Dragon came out a year and a half before Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which meant that when that card came out and when you went to the movie and got it in your pack, you had no actual legal way of summoning it in a real game. In other words, while Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon did technically see play as a one-of in some of those later fusion decks when Cyberstein was legal for that very last year, most people, when they think back to Cyberstein in a competitive sense, are more afraid of cards like Cyber Twin Dragon or Cyber End Dragon, not Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, because that 500 attack in most cases isn't worth foregoing the effects of Cyber End Dragon. At least the card could reasonably be summoned sometimes with the Cyberstein example, but in the next example, which was in 2015, you were only using it as a level 12 monster that sits in your extra deck for NEKROZ of Kaleidoscope. NEKROZ of Kaleidoscope is a very interesting ritual spell card that sort of broke the mechanic in a few ways. One of the ways that it did this was let you send one monster from your extra deck to the graveyard instead of tributing monsters in your hand or on your side of the field. That's a pretty big step up, and NEKROZ had all sorts of monsters with all sorts of levels that you could summon off of that one ritual spell, and one of the things that you would sometimes want to do is summon like a level 8 monster and a level 4 monster, and you could do that by sending level 12 from your extra deck to the graveyard. Because NEKROZ had no real way of summoning whichever level 12 monster that they decided to put in their extra deck, most people just chose whichever level 12 monster was their favorite, which for a lot of people was Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. This is what I mean by the card technically saw play twice. At least the first time it was able to be summoned, but the second time it was only seen play because of its level and because it goes in the extra deck, nothing to do with how good or bad the card is. Which, by the way, if you've gathered anything from those two examples, this card isn't very good. It's not a very competitive card. It doesn't mean that it's completely unplayable. We saw two fringe examples of where it technically saw play as a one-of. It just means that this card wasn't actually worth it. Not nearly as strong as a lot of people that are fans of the anime hoped it would be when it came to the TCG. Like, even if this card just had one usable effect, maybe along the lines of Five-Headed Dragon's protection effect, maybe then it would be worth talking about, at least in terms of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Sadly, because this card has zero effects, we can only evaluate this card on how hard it is to summon and how many attack points it has. And while I do want to look at how easy or hard this card is to summon, I think because this card has no effects, it's really important to look at it from a perspective of, okay, if you manage to get this thing on the board, how much does it actually bring to the table? table. What does 4500 attack actually mean in a competitive landscape? Well, the problem is that when you think back to the anime, and Kaiba has this big opening line when he summons this card that says like something along the lines of, I'm combining the power level of all three Blue Eyes' attacks into one monster, and then you look at the card and yeah, 4500 is a lot, but hey, wait a second, I just lost 9,000 potential attack points and I only got 4500 out of it. And while I don't think Konami was thinking this far ahead whenever those attack points were decided upon, it is worth mentioning that in 2006, if you could summon a 9,000 attack monster off of Cyberstein, it would have made that card even more overpowered than it already was. However, because you're trading 3 monsters with 3,000 attack for 1 monster with 4,500 attack, it's worth asking the question, well, why are you doing that? Why do I have to lose 4 cards just to summon 1 monster? Because not only do you lose the Blue Eyes, hopefully you didn't manage to summon them, because then you have to factor in the tributes, and that means that you're losing even more cards, but if you kept all 3 in your hand and then you use the polymerization, you're trading 4 cards to summon 1 monster. But wait a second, that 1 monster that you summon only has 1,500 more attack than the monsters that you traded for it, and you just lost a whole bunch of cards. Isn't that kind of a ripoff? And the answer is yes, it is. That's one of the biggest problems with this card. Because you see, while it is important, I guess, in some fringe scenario where you want to run over a monster that has more than 3,000 attack, it might matter in that case that you have a monster with 4,500. In most cases, even across all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, as long as a monster has 3,000 attack, it doesn't really matter how much higher than that it goes, especially if you trade any good effects that it might have had at 3,000 attack. Now, maybe good effects isn't the best comparison here because this card has 0 effects, but what I'm trying to say is that if Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon was a 3,000 attack monster that took 3 Blue Eyes but actually had usable effects, maybe then it would have been a more competitive card. The fact is that when you trade 4 cards for something, that 1 card you're summoning better be really, really powerful to make up for the cards that you lost. But wait a minute, you say, there's not only that one way to summon this thing. You don't have to use polymerization. For example, you can put 3 Blue Eyes in the graveyard throughout the course of the duel and then activate Dragon's Mirror to summon this card as a 1-for-1 trade. And in that case, yes, it is a lot better to summon this thing when you only have to lose that Dragon's Mirror, but hear me out, because a big thing happens when you realize that Dragon's Mirror banishing 3 Blue Eyes is almost all the way to Dragon's Mirror summoning 5-headed dragon, a card with 500 more attack and actual protection effects, which admittedly these days aren't that powerful, but at least back in the day, 5-headed dragon was a more formidable foe than something like Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, just because it couldn't be destroyed by battle with most attributes. And while I'm sure at least one person has thought, but that's not worth it because you have to banish 2 more dragons with Dragon's Mirrors, so isn't that more of a setup? It shouldn't really be a huge difference, because in the decks that are playing these cards, they should be playing mostly dragon monsters, and it shouldn't be too difficult to get 5 in the graveyard if you already are trying to get 3. And for that reason, when you can just banish 2 more monsters, which once again doesn't factor into card advantage because they're all already in your graveyard, when you can banish 2 more dragons and get a much more powerful monster, which admittedly isn't as iconic but much better in a competitive sense, well then you definitely have to ask yourself, what's the point of actually going for Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon other than trying to be cool if I could just go for a much better card? And this obviously gets a little bit more complicated when we add in that 5-headed dragon isn't quite good enough for competitive play, but at least in some cases 5-headed dragon has seen some experimentation in the past, much more so than something like Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which only really saw play when you could cheat it out with Cyberstein or send to the graveyard with a Kaleidoscope. Not to mention that in some cases it's actually easier to get 5 random dragons for 5-headed dragon than it is to get 3 specific Blue Eyes White Dragons, even though there are some cards these days that count as Blue Eyes White Dragon while in the graveyard. So you can see how Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, the original one, is in a very tough spot, because in any single case that you could cheat it out with an effect like Cyberstein or Dragon's Mirror, there's almost always a better card that you'd rather summon. Luckily though, not all hope is lost, because Konami is printing a Blue Eyes alternative Ultimate Dragon in an upcoming release. This thing is already out in the OCG, and while this card isn't the most competitive card, it is so much better than the original Ultimate Dragon, it's not even funny. It has the exact same summoning requirements, but it also has a ton of bonus effects, and it protects itself. If you want to summon Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, but you want to summon one that isn't a total waste of all of your cards, this is definitely the card that you want to make. Even if it's a more casual version of Blue Eyes as an entire strategy, it's still a pretty cool way to play an iconic monster without just throwing away any chance of victory. I do want to mention that I'm sorry that it took 4 months between this upload and the last serious Why Nobody Plays video. I know I did that one for April Fool's Day, but I'm not really counting that because that was just sort of a joke entry to the series. This takes some time, it really does, and it takes me a while not only to script the video and to record the video and to upload the video and all those things, but I think in particular, more so than any of the other series that I do on this channel, I really want to make sure that the cards that I'm talking about in the Why Nobody Plays series are not ones that I just come up with overnight. I have a list of cards that are potential candidates to make it in this video, and I'll sit on them for weeks, if not months, just to fully make sure, yes, this is the card that I want to talk about, it's worth discussing, it's iconic enough to be recognized by ex-Yu-Gi-Oh players, but also it has some real discussion that can be applied to real competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! That's a pretty interesting mix of different criteria that a card needs to have to be discussed in these videos, and it takes me a while to actually settle on a card being an absolute choice. Anyway though, thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I'll try to make it not 4 months before the next one. I'll probably try to do 1 a month going forward, maybe 1 every 2 months if it takes me a little bit longer than I predict it does. But anyway, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.